Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third part of our lecture. This portion is going to talk about a component of our identity, and that specifically is ability, thinking about ability and disability. Let's go ahead and jump on in. We're going to talk about disability first. A disability is a physical or mental condition that limits a person's movement, senses, or activities. The fact or state of having such a condition. Now, what I wanted to mention to you specifically, because we're going to be working with families and children, is that having a disability for school-age children to qualify for services through school, you have to qualify under one of the 13 categories. And this is defined under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Those 13 categories include intellectual disability, hearing impairment, speech and language impairment, visual impairment, emotional disturbance, orthopedic impairment, autism, traumatic brain injury, other health impairment, deaf-blind, multiple disability, specific learning disability, and deafness. Okay, so there are certain ways to receive services once you are school age. And again, those services start as soon as you turn 3. So it goes for a while. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the history of how we've approached people with disabilities in our country. In 1829, that's when we had the invention of Braille. So being able to have people who were blind be able to access material and learn and read. And then in 1907, we saw eugenics movement, the sterilization laws. That was in 25 states. So if they viewed you as being disabled, they were able to sterilize you. And that was part of our eugenics movement here in this country. In 1939, the eugenics movement moved to Nazi Germany, and we saw about 75,000 to 250,000 people killed because of having disabilities. After that, in 1975, so kind of a significant gap there, about 36 years, we saw the Education of Handicapped Children Act occur in our country. So kind of giving some rights to children around whether or not they have access to education. In 1990, we had the Americans with Disabilities Act. So looking at making sure that people with disabilities could have access to environments in the community, right? Making sure there was ramps and access and ability for people to get up and down and elevators and all of those pieces. And then in 1990, we also had a transition from the Education of Handicapped Children Act, and it became IDEA, which is Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So we saw a transformation there. And then around 1991, we saw autism become a category under education. So prior to that, autism obviously existed, but it wasn't one of the qualifying categories to receive education, or special education, I should say. And then we also saw Rose's Law, intellectual disability, change shortly after that. And what that was is we moved from the terminology of mental retardation to intellectual disability. So really thinking about it differently, because again, thinking about how we influence children and their attitudes, language matters. Okay? All right, there's different models of how we can think about disabilities or how we frame it in our minds, what lens we're looking through. The two main ones are medical model and the social model. So the medical model looks at an individual person based on issue. It views a disability as something that can be treated or resolved. It doesn't take into account social factors. So we see this kind of push and pull with autism, or we did at least, thinking about how we can cure autism. And then also the other end of the continuum, the social model, is more how can we accept people with autism, and how do we make sure that things are accessible and we honor their neurodivergence. So the medical model would look at it like they have autism, there's a problem to be solved, what treatment can we provide? The social model would look more at how can we ensure that they are honored and incorporated into communities and given the right accommodations. There's additional models that we can think about. The charity model would look at it from a lens of if you have a disability or you have somebody in your family that has a disability, that warrants pity and consideration and kindness. A religious would look more of it like the lens of you've been either given a gift or a curse or possible punishment. That's the lens they're going to look at disabilities through. A cultural lens would look more about how are these communities connected? How is there a history with these people? A great example of this is deaf culture. They have looked at their disability as a cultural component. They belong as a unit, as a community. There are pieces that, in order to belong, you need to understand. And looking at the economic version, when we look at through the economic lens of disabilities, we're really thinking about disabilities as, are people able to contribute to society, or are they a drain on society? Are they taking resources, or are they able to put back in? I would argue that they're never a drain, but I don't think of disabilities through an economic lens. But if you did, that's how you would think about it: drain or contribution. Okay. The last one is a human rights model. So when we think about disabilities, are we thinking about, social factors? Are we thinking about the policies and laws that need to be put in place in order to view them as equal to people who don't have disabilities? So these are just the different lenses that you might hear people talk about disabilities and think about disabilities. And they all have their kind of place and understanding attitudes towards disabilities, right? If you look at a disability as a medical model, you're obviously going to look at it differently than if you look at it from a social model. Again, if we go back to our example of autism, we could see how that would be really impactful for children with autism, and also for children who don't have autism but should be exposed and interacting with children with autism, right? Because they're part of the community as well. Now, there's different types of language we can use when we think about disabilities. The first one I want to cover is called person-first language. And the idea behind person-first language is that the disability is part of them. It does not define them. So if we were talking about somebody with Down syndrome, we would say a person with Down syndrome. Autism, we'd say a person with autism. Now, we also have what's called identity-first language. And that's when you would put the disability first because they feel like it's a very defining part of who they are. And there is some discrepancy right now in the autism community over person first versus identity first language. Some people prefer to be called a person with autism, while other people would rather be called an autistic person. Again, if you are dealing with somebody, that is their identity, so it is up to them. So I would encourage you to ask them. Another thing about identity first language is that it really has a place where they feel like it connects them to their history and their culture and a community. So going back to the way we think about disabilities again, right? And not feeling the sense of it's something that should be ashamed of. It is definitely something that they feel connected to. It defines them, and they want to make sure that they highlight that because it's a big part of who they are. So again, thinking about most disabilities, you would, for example, Down syndrome, you would use person first language, but there are some disabilities that you would switch to identity first language. And if you're ever unsure, again, we honor the person who has the disability, and that is a question to ask them. Now, when we think about how we can frame disabilities or what happens when we don't have exposure to disabilities and we have kind of a prejudice or discrimination against people with disabilities, that's called ableism. And ableism is defined as discrimination in favor of able-bodied people, prejudice or disregard of the needs of disabled people. And this can be obscure, meaning that we're not really aware that it's happening, and it can be really obvious, right? So an obvious example would be, I can't give this person a job, they're in a wheelchair. So they may not, be able to perform the task. That is an obvious form of ableism. An obscure form of ableism might be more around if you talk louder to somebody who is in a wheelchair, or if you don't provide them access accidentally, there's not a ramp, or you have a lot of lights in your shop and a lot of noise happening. Well, that may be insensitive to people who have more neurodiversity. So all of these things are happening all the time, and they're built into society as the norm. So it's something to be aware of as we move forward. Okay. There is a difference in how ableism functions as just kind of the norm and what we should be doing, and that's providing access and accommodations. And access and accommodation removes barriers and obstacles from access and inclusion. And these things could be physical barriers, right? The idea of, think about when you go into a building that is ADA compliant. A lot of times they'll have a way to open the door that doesn't require hands. They might have one of those switches you push, or one that is motion censored. That is ADA compliant. We benefited as able-bodied, but people with disabilities also benefit because it's access and accommodation. Now, they don't always have to be physical barriers. They can be things like giving somebody more time to process information, turning down the light so it's not so bright. All of those things also give access and inclusion to people who have different abilities. I think just moving beyond how we think of things and being aware that lots of people have different needs. And most of the time, when we provide access and accommodations, we all benefit. So that's actually a model if you ever want to look it up. We did talk about it earlier in the class called Universal Design of Learning. We apply it now in educational systems, but they actually came from a place of construction around ADA and providing access to everybody. Universal design. Okay, so just something to think about if you want to do some more research. With that, we're going to pause here. I'm going to come back to you and we'll do our last piece around gender, and then your lecture will be done. All right, see you then.